I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
It is one of the peculiar vanities of London society that it will dress itself in ceremonial splendor whenever art requires an audience. And on that damp April evening in Belgrave Square, no gathering was more elegantly assembled than Lady Eustacia Vale's private salon. The invitation had been coveted among the city's cultural elite. An intimate recital by Ambrose Hart, the violinist whose name had lately adorned every fashionable tongue, performing upon the legendary Guarneri del Gesù from Sir Benedict Crowthorne's celebrated collection. I confess that I had not intended to attend. Music, like higher mathematics, has always struck me as a language that refuses to yield its secrets to my practical mind. But Captain Lionel Vale, Lady Eustacia's nephew and my old army companion, had pressed me into service with that particular brand of English earnestness that emerges when gentlemen suspect they are being imposed upon by the arts. "You must come, Hastings," he had insisted with uncharacteristic gravity. "Hart is to play the Guarneri for the first time in public. Well, private public, if you take my meaning. And there's some French painting Lady Vale has acquired. Ghastly thing, really. Shows a violinist playing to empty chairs. Rather fits the evening's theme, don't you think?" The drawing rooms of Lady Vale's Belgrave Square mansion hummed with the refined murmur of perhaps 30 carefully selected guests. Lady Vale herself presided with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to orchestrating both social and cultural events, her dark eyes taking in every detail with the precision of a military commander surveying a battlefield. She possessed that particular quality of handsome, intelligent women who have learned to wield their influence through seemingly effortless charm. In the smaller green salon, the centerpiece of the evening's mystery hung upon the silk-covered walls. Le violoniste qui joua pour personne, the violinist who played for no one. The painting depicted a solitary musician upon an empty stage, his bow poised above the strings while rows of vacant seats stretched away into shadowy depths. Most curious of all was the clock visible above the proscenium, its hands pointing impossibly to 13, a detail that would later prove more significant than any of us could have imagined. Sir Benedict Crowthorne, the collector whose prized Guarneri would grace the evening's performance, stood before his treasured instrument with the proprietary affection of a father regarding his finest child. A man of considerable learning and even greater wealth, Sir Benedict had devoted his later years to preserving the world's most exceptional musical instruments. His large, benevolent features bore the satisfied expression of someone who has successfully married passion with purpose. "She is temperamental, this one," he explained to the small circle gathered around the violin case, his voice carrying the reverent tone reserved for discussing either religion or priceless artifacts. Giuseppe Guarneri crafted her in 1734, and she has been singing for nearly 3 centuries. Tonight, she performs again after a silence of 20 years. Among the assembled guests, several figures commanded particular attention through their connection to the evening's star performer. Dr. Armand Pellerin, the distinguished music critic whose reviews could make or destroy a career, examined the Guarneri with the calculating gaze of a jeweler appraising diamonds. His reputation for devastating honesty had earned him both respect and enmity in equal measure. "Hart possesses technique," he observed to no one in particular, adjusting his spectacles with surgical precision, "but technique without soul is merely mechanical exercise. We shall see if the Guarneri can inspire what nature may have withheld." Nearby, Lydia Quayle, Mrs. Hart, as she insisted upon being addressed, watched her husband's admirers with the steady intensity of a woman who has learned to guard her territory. Her square jaw and uncompromising mouth suggested a character more suited to boardroom negotiations than drawing-room pleasantries. Yet her marriage to the celebrated violinist had thrust her into a world where charm was currency, and she possessed precious little to spend. Felix Ardmore, The impresario whose silver tongue had arranged countless successful concerts across Europe hovered at the periphery with the nervous energy of a man whose reputation depended upon the evening's success. His silvered hair and prosperous appearance spoke of years spent cultivating the right connections, yet his anxious glances toward the music room betrayed deeper concerns than mere professional worry. Miss Rosamond Kerr, Hart's most promising pupil, stood apart from the main gathering with the uncomfortable air of someone uncertain of their place in such elevated company. At 25, she possessed the delicate beauty and intense focus that marked her as a serious musician, yet her pale complexion and nervous manner suggested that tonight's performance held particular significance for her future. Thomas Finch, the instrument restorer who had been engaged to examine the Guarneri's condition, moved through the gathering with the careful precision of a craftsman among collectors. His trained eye noted details that others missed, and his reverent handling of the violin's case spoke of someone who understood the true value of what lay within. As the appointed hour approached, Ambrose Hart made his entrance with the natural grace that had charmed audiences across 2 continents. Younger than his reputation suggested, perhaps 32, he possessed the fine features and confident bearing that made both critics and admirers take notice. His greeting to Lady Vale was perfectly pitched between gratitude and professional dignity, while his reunion with Sir Benedict's Guarneri carried the tenderness of lovers long separated. "You will forgive me," Hart announced to the assembled company, "if I observe an old habit before we begin. I prefer to acquaint myself with a new instrument in private. A quarter-hour of solitude to, shall we say, introduce ourselves properly." Lady Vale inclined her head graciously. "Of course, Mr. Hart. We shall await your pleasure." Hart lifted the Guarneri with practiced care, testing its weight and balance before tucking it beneath his chin in a gesture both intimate and professional. "I shall play for no one," he said quietly, tapping the green salon door with his bow. "Before I play for everyone." The soft click of the latch seemed to echo through the suddenly hushed drawing room as Hart disappeared into the green salon, taking the precious violin with him. For a few moments, the faint sound of tuning and tentative scales drifted through the heavy door, then settled into a melody of haunting beauty that spoke of both technical mastery and deep emotional understanding. The gathered guests resumed their conversations in lowered tones as though unwilling to disturb the private communion taking place beyond the door. Time passed with the peculiar elasticity that accompanies anticipation, minutes that felt like hours, yet somehow slipped away unnoticed. It was Lady Vale who first noted the silence. The music had ceased, and the quarter hour had stretched well beyond its appointed limit. Felix Ardmore approached the door with growing concern, his polite knocks receiving no response. When his calls to Hart went unanswered, a chill began to settle over the elegant gathering. "The key?" Lady Vale inquired of her companion, Miss Evie March. "Mr. Hart took it with him, my lady," came the flustered reply. "He said the latch was unreliable." What followed was a scene that would remain etched in my memory with crystalline clarity. The door, forced open by the combined efforts of several gentlemen, revealed a tableau that transformed our refined evening into something far more sinister. Ambrose Hart sat slumped in the chair opposite the painting, the Guarneri resting across his knees as though he had simply paused between movements. The bow drooped from his right hand, and his head was tilted at an angle that initially suggested deep concentration. Only the thin line across his throat, precise as a surgeon's incision, and the snapped violin string coiled like a serpent at his feet, revealed the terrible truth. The E string, finest and most delicate of the 4, had been fashioned into an instrument of death with deadly efficiency. The room itself remained in perfect order. The windows were latched from within, the key lay upon the side table where Hart had placed it, and nothing appeared disturbed save for the grotesque centerpiece of our discovery. The painting above the mantel seemed to mock us with its prophetic title. Here indeed was a violinist who would play for no one, silenced forever in a room that had become his tomb. Dr. Sir Pellerin, his critical faculties intact even in crisis, confirmed what we all feared. "He is dead," he announced with clinical precision, "and has been so for some time." As Lady Vale summoned the police and the household fell into shocked silence, I found myself studying the faces around me with new understanding. Someone among this carefully curated gathering possessed both the means and the motive to transform an evening of cultural refinement into a stage for murder. The locked room, the impossible crime, the symbolic use of the violin string, all pointed to a mind both clever and coldly calculating. It was then that I made a decision that would prove crucial to unraveling the mystery. "Lionel?" I said quietly to my companion as he prepared to telephone the authorities. "After you've contacted Inspector Japp, inquire whether Monsieur Hercule Poirot is available in London. Something tells me we shall have need of his particular talents before this affair reaches its conclusion." The stage was set, the players assembled, and the first act of our drama had ended in death. But as I gazed upon the faces of our fellow guests, each now a potential suspect in this most refined of murders, I knew that the true performance was only just beginning. The minutes that followed held that peculiar blend of controlled activity and hushed reverence that visits refined households when tragedy intrudes upon elegant surroundings. Lady Vale, though visibly shaken, maintained the composure that her position demanded, issuing quiet instructions to her staff while ensuring that the scene remained undisturbed. The drawing room, which moments before had hummed with cultured conversation, now felt heavy with unspoken suspicions as the assembled guests found themselves transformed from audience to potential suspects. Lionel's telephone call to Scotland Yard brought the swift response that serious crimes in Belgrave Square invariably commanded. Within 30 minutes, Inspector Japp arrived with his characteristic blend of practical efficiency and barely concealed irritation at finding himself confronted with yet another puzzle that defied conventional explanation. His weathered face, marked by years of dealing with London's criminal element, surveyed the locked salon with the methodical thoroughness that had earned him his reputation. "Suicide seems the obvious conclusion," Japp announced after his initial examination, though his tone carried less conviction than his words suggested. "These artistic types, temperamental, you know. Perhaps the pressure of performing on such a valuable instrument proved overwhelming." Dr. Pellerin, who had maintained his position near the body with the detached interest of one accustomed to observing human frailty, cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may venture a professional observation, Inspector, the angle and depth of the wound suggest external infliction. The trajectory speaks against self-destruction." It was at this moment that the soft, precise voice of Hercule Poirot drifted through the doorway like a gentle breeze carrying the promise of clarity. "Ah, mon ami Hastings, once again you find yourself in the presence of the impossible, n'est-ce pas?" The little Belgian detective entered with his characteristic measured steps, his egg-shaped head tilting as he absorbed every detail of the tragic tableau before him. "Poirot," I exclaimed with genuine relief. "Thank heavens you could come so quickly." "But naturally, mon vieux. When Hastings calls, Poirot responds. Though I confess I was in the midst of arranging my evening toilette when your urgent message arrived." His keen grey eyes moved systematically around the room, noting details that the rest of us had overlooked entirely. Inspector Japp, who had worked with Poirot on numerous previous occasions, nodded with grudging respect. "Evening, Monsieur Poirot. Glad you're here, though I still maintain this looks straightforward enough." "Suicide, you suggest?" Poirot approached the body with reverent care, studying Hart's position without disturbing the scene. His attention focused particularly on the violinist's hands and the precise placement of the guarneri across his knees. "Most curious, mon ami. Observe, if you please, the bow." We followed his gaze to where the bow had fallen from Hart's right hand, its horsehair intact and properly tensioned. A violinist's bow is precious beyond measure, Poirot continued thoughtfully. Would a man intent on self-destruction take such care to preserve it from damage? No, this arrangement speaks of another hand, one that understood the symbolic importance of the scene being created. Moving with deliberate precision, Poirot began his methodical questioning of the witnesses. The timeline emerged with crystalline clarity. Hart had entered the green salon at 5 minutes to 9, requesting the key from Miss March due to the unreliable latch. The recital was scheduled to commence at 9:15, but when 9:30 arrived without Hart's reappearance, concern grew into alarm. And during this interval of 35 minutes, Poirot inquired gently, where was each of you positioned? Felix Ardmore, perspiring despite the evening's coolness, admitted to hovering near the door, hearing first the tentative scales, then a passage of Bach, followed by an increasingly troubling silence. Sir Benedict had moved restlessly between rooms, his paternal concern for the precious Guarneri evident in every anxious glance. Mrs. Hart, maintaining her rigid composure, stated that her husband detested interruption during his preparation rituals. Miss Rosamond Kerr, colouring deeply, confessed to positioning herself on the landing where she could just discern the music, noting that Hart's tempo seemed unusually slow. Always slow, this particular passage? Poirot inquired with gentle interest. No, Rosamond replied hesitantly. Tonight it seemed deliberate, as though he were saying farewell to each note. Dr. Pellerin claimed to have engaged in heated discussion with another guest about the merits of gut versus steel strings, while Thomas Finch had stationed himself protectively near the empty violin case, a fresh score on his forefinger evidence of his afternoon's careful adjustments to the instrument. Poirot's attention returned to the painting above the mantel, his head tilting as he studied the depicted violinist and the impossible clock showing 13. Most prophetic, he murmured. Lady Vale, this acquisition was recent, I understand. Only last month, from a private collector in Paris. The symbolism seemed appropriate for tonight's intimate performance. Indeed, the symbolism. Poirot's fingers stroked his magnificent mustache in the gesture I recognized as indicating deep concentration. Tell me, mes amis, did anyone observe Monsieur Hart's demeanor this evening? His spirits? His conversation? The responses painted a picture of a man in excellent humor, speaking enthusiastically of future engagements and recording opportunities. Yet something in the careful arrangement of the scene, the almost artistic precision of the murder, suggested a killer who understood not merely how to kill, but how to transform death into a grotesque masterpiece. As Poirot requested time alone in the green salon, I found myself studying the faces around me with new understanding. Someone among this gathering possessed both the means and the motive to orchestrate this impossible crime, and I knew that only Poirot's remarkable methods could unravel the truth hidden beneath layers of cultured deception. While the assembled guests remained under Inspector Japp's watchful supervision in the main drawing room, Poirot conducted his solitary examination of the green salon with the methodical precision that marked all his investigations. The little Belgian detective moved through the scene like a conductor studying a complex musical score, his keen grey eyes noting details that would escape less trained observers. He began with the victim himself, studying Hart's position without disturbing the carefully arranged tableau. The violinist sat slumped in the chair opposite the prophetic painting, the precious Guarneri, resting across his knees with almost ceremonial precision. The bow had fallen from his right hand, its horsehair intact and properly tensioned, a detail that struck Poirot as significant. You see, mon ami Hastings, he murmured, beckoning me closer. Observe the precision of this arrangement, the instrument placed just so, the bow fallen at the precise angle to suggest a moment of artistic contemplation, interrupted by death. Yet the wound itself speaks of violence, not the peaceful surrender that suicide might suggest. Moving to examine the room itself, Poirot's attention focused on subtle disturbances that revealed the presence of another hand. 2 faint arcs in the carpet showed where the chair had been, moved forward and then carefully repositioned. On the chair's arm, barely visible grains of powder caught the light. Not rosin, as one might expect, but something finer and more delicate. Violet powder, Poirot observed, producing his magnifying glass. Madame Hart's particular fragrance, I believe, yet she claims never to have entered this room during her husband's preparation. Most curious. At the tall windows overlooking the private garden, Poirot discovered a thin diagonal smear in the condensation on the glass, as though someone had traced a finger part way across the surface before withdrawing. The windows remained securely latched from within, but the mark suggested recent contact from inside the room. His examination of the mantelpiece revealed another intriguing detail. The ornate clock showed a time 6 minutes slower than his own precise timepiece. For a man of Hart's reputation for punctuality, such a discrepancy seemed deliberately significant. The timeline troubles me, Hastings. Our victim was known for his precision, yet something in the chronology does not harmonize with the established facts. When Inspector Japp grew impatient for formal statements, Poirot agreed to begin the individual interviews, starting with those who had the most direct contact with both Hart and the precious Guarneri. Thomas Finch, the instrument restorer, entered the blue salon with the careful deference of a craftsman among his betters. "You attended to the instrument today, Monsieur Finch?" Poirot inquired gently. "Routine maintenance, sir. Bridge and sound post secure, fingerboard polished. I replaced the E-string as well. Mr. Hart preferred steel at the top register. Gut strings fray and produce unpleasant squealing under pressure." Poirot noted the small bandage wrapped around Finch's left index finger. "An occupational hazard? The sharp strings?" "Indeed, sir. Cut myself adjusting the tension this afternoon. These old instruments require delicate handling, but the strings themselves can be treacherous." The interview with Mrs. Hart proved particularly revealing. Her composed manner seemed almost rehearsed, her responses delivered with mechanical precision that suggested careful preparation. "Your husband's recent state of mind, madam. Had you observed any changes?" "Ambrose was under considerable pressure, Monsieur Poirot. Cancelled concerts, declining bookings. The musical world can be cruel to those whose technical skills begin to falter." Her pause carried implications that extended beyond mere professional concerns. Felix Ardmore's nervous energy became more pronounced under Poirot's gentle questioning. The impresario admitted that Hart's reliability had become questionable, with several venues expressing concerns about his recent performances. "The financial pressures were mounting," Ardmore confessed, dabbing perspiration from his brow. Tonight was meant to be a revival, a demonstration that Hart remained at the peak of his abilities. The Guarneri was to be his salvation. Young Rosamond Kerr's interview revealed the complex emotional undercurrents that had surrounded the evening's performance. Her obvious devotion to Hart as both teacher and performer was complicated by deeper feelings she struggled to articulate. "He promised to recommend me for the Brahms competition," she revealed with obvious distress. "This performance was to be my audition, in a sense. But when I listened from the landing, his tempo seemed so slow, so deliberate, as though he was saying farewell to each note." Dr. Pellerin's clinical assessment of Hart's recent decline provided professional context for the mounting pressures. His technique remained excellent, but the interpretive depth had become increasingly mechanical. The soul of the music seemed to elude him. As the interviews concluded, Poirot's expression carried the satisfaction of one who has begun to perceive the underlying pattern within apparent chaos. The locked room might have seemed impossible, but the human motivations and hidden relationships were beginning to reveal themselves with crystalline clarity. "The physical evidence tells one story, mes amis," he announced to Japp and myself, "but the psychological evidence suggests quite another. Someone among our refined gathering possesses both the means and the motive to transform this evening of cultural refinement into a stage for murder, most ingenious. The morning brought with it the peculiar clarity that follows a night of tragedy, when shock gives way to the methodical business of investigation. Inspector Japp arrived early, his weathered features set in the determined expression of a man who believed he had found his solution. The physical evidence gathered overnight had crystallized into what appeared to be an unassailable case, and he was eager to present his findings to Poirot. "The violet powder settles it, Monsieur Poirot," Japp declared with satisfaction, producing a small evidence envelope. "Found traces on the chair arm where Hart was sitting. And look here, Mrs. Hart's gloves show the same powder on the fingertips. She claims she never entered the room after it was locked, but the evidence says otherwise." Poirot examined the pale grey kidskin gloves with his characteristic thoroughness, noting the faint mauve bloom that clung to the delicate leather. "Most interesting, mon ami. And Madame Hart's explanation for this powder? Says she refreshed her perfume in the powder room after dinner, then claims she might have touched the chair earlier when that restorer fellow was examining the violin. But Lady Vale's housekeeper swears the room was dusted at 6 o'clock sharp, after any such earlier contact would have occurred." The logic seemed compelling, and I found myself nodding in agreement. Mrs. Hart's cold composure throughout the evening had struck me as unnaturally controlled, her lack of visible grief suggesting either remarkable self-possession or calculated indifference to her husband's fate. Japp continued with growing confidence. The motives clear enough. Hart's career was declining, their finances were strained, and she stood to inherit considerably from his family trust. The method shows planning too. She had access to the house, knew the routine, and could have prepared the scene in advance. "And the locked room, Inspector?" Poirot inquired mildly. "Window, most likely. My men found disturbances in the garden below, scuffed earth near the boxwood hedging, and fresh scratches on the exterior paint. Someone went out that way, though it would take nerve and agility." Poirot moved to examine Mrs. Hart's evening gown with the same meticulous attention he had given to the gloves. The hem showed no trace of soil or moisture that would indicate contact with the garden, and the delicate fabric remained pristine despite the evening's dramatic events. "The physical evidence troubles me, mon ami," Poirot observed thoughtfully. "Consider the precision required for such an escape, through a window into a garden, without disturbing one's evening attire or leaving more substantial traces. And the scene itself, arranged with such theatrical exactness. The violin placed just so, the bow fallen at the precise angle to suggest artistic contemplation interrupted by death." Thomas Finch, who had been quietly observing our discussion, stepped forward with the diffident manner of one who possesses technical knowledge but hesitates to contradict authority. "If I may, Inspector, there's something about the string that puzzles me. I replaced the E string yesterday afternoon with steel wire. Mr. Hart specifically requested it, said gut strings produced unpleasant squealing under pressure, but when I examined the murder weapon, the broken string appeared to be gut, not steel." This revelation brought our investigation to an abrupt halt. Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with interest as he processed this unexpected detail. "You are certain of this distinction, Monsieur Finch?" "Absolutely certain, sir. Steel produces a bright, almost silvery tone, while gut has a warmer, more mellow quality. The string used to kill Mr. Hart was definitely gut. Old gut, I'd say, from the way it frayed." The implications were staggering. Someone had not only planned Hart's murder, but had come prepared with the specific type of string needed to create the symbolic weapon. This level of premeditation suggested a mind far more calculating than Mrs. Hart's straightforward desperation would require. Sir Benedict Crowthorne, who had remained silent during our discussion, finally spoke with obvious reluctance. "I fear I must share something that may be relevant to your investigation. Hart had become increasingly erratic in recent months, not merely in his performances, but in his treatment of the instruments themselves. Last autumn, he damaged the bridge of my Stradivarius during a private recital. When I expressed concern, he became quite agitated, claiming that the instruments were holding him back rather than inspiring him. The elderly collector's revelation painted a picture of an artist in crisis, struggling not only with declining abilities but with a growing resentment toward the very tools of his trade. He had approached me repeatedly about purchasing the Guarneri outright, offering sums that suggested desperation rather than mere professional ambition. I'd begun to question the wisdom of allowing him continued access to such irreplaceable instruments. Miss Evie March, Lady Vale's companion, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle when Poirot questioned her about the room's security arrangements. "The latch wasn't actually unreliable, sir," she admitted nervously. "Her ladyship instructed me to loosen it yesterday afternoon. She said Mr. Hart preferred absolute privacy for his preparations and wanted to ensure he could secure himself completely without interruption." This detail transformed the locked room from an inexplicable mystery into a carefully orchestrated stage. Someone had planned for Hart to be alone and undisturbed, creating the perfect conditions for what appeared to be an impossible crime. "You see, Inspector," Poirot said gently, "while Madame Hart certainly possessed motive and opportunity, the crime itself speaks of a different kind of mind entirely. The symbolic use of the violin string, the theatrical arrangement of the scene, the careful preparation of the locked room, these suggest someone who understood not merely how to kill, but how to transform death into a grotesque masterpiece." Japp's confidence wavered as the evidence began to contradict his neat solution. "But the powder, Monsieur Poirot, how do you explain that?" "Ah, the powder. That, mon ami, may be our first glimpse of the true killer's method, not evidence of guilt, but evidence of misdirection. Someone wished us to suspect Madame Hart, and they have succeeded admirably in creating that impression." As the morning progressed, it became clear that the obvious solution was merely the first layer of a far more complex deception. The true murderer had not only planned Hart's death, but had carefully constructed a web of false evidence designed to implicate the most convenient suspect. Poirot's expression carried the satisfaction of one who sees through such elaborate misdirection to the psychological truth beneath. "The violinist who played for no one, mes amis," he murmured, gazing once more at the prophetic painting. "But perhaps the performance we have witnessed is not the one we were meant to see. The true artistry lies not in the murder itself, but in the careful orchestration of our investigation, and someone among our refined gathering has been conducting this deadly symphony from the very beginning." The morning's revelations had fundamentally shifted the trajectory of our investigation, yet Poirot remained unsatisfied with the neat conclusions that seemed to present themselves. Inspector Japp's confidence in Mrs. Hart's guilt, while supported by the violet powder evidence, troubled the little Belgian detective in ways that his methodical nature compelled him to explore further. "Come, Hastings," Poirot announced, donning his overcoat with characteristic precision. "We must examine the garden. Physical evidence tells one story, but the little grey cells insist there is more to discover." The rectangle of lawn below the green salon window showed the disturbances that Japp had cited as proof of the killer's escape route. A scrape of soil at the border where the box hedging began, a smudge of pale paint on a twig, and a shallow impression on the gravel path suggested recent activity. Yet as Poirot knelt to examine the disturbed earth, his keen eyes detected subtleties that the inspector had overlooked. "Observe, mon ami," he murmured, touching 2 fingers to the scuffed patch. "The edges of this disturbance are dark with moisture, not bright as they would be if recently made. The dew has crept inward, suggesting this mark was created before the heaviest dew settled, then left untouched through the night. To stage an exit, perhaps, rather than to accomplish one." Standing beneath the tall window, Poirot produced a length of thin cord and demonstrated how it might be passed around the window latch, pulled taut to release the mechanism from outside. The cord left a diagonal mark across the condensation, precisely matching what we had observed inside the room. Yet the complexity of such a maneuver, requiring both preparation and considerable dexterity, seemed inconsistent with a crime of passion. The method is possible, Poirot concluded, but it speaks of premeditation rather than desperate impulse. Someone wished us to believe in this escape route, just as someone wished us to discover the violet powder on Madame Hart's gloves. Our return to the house brought a request to examine the footwear of all present, a suggestion that produced visible discomfort among the assembled guests. Thomas Finch's sturdy Oxfords bore a faint bloom of pale dust at the welt, which he attributed to brushing against the skirting near the instrument case. Miss Kerr's practical shoes showed a dark ring where leather met sole, consistent with contact with damp grass, or merely the wet pavement outside. Nothing definitive emerged, yet the exercise served to heighten the growing tension among our suspects. It was during this examination that Poirot made another discovery that would prove significant. In the Guarneri's accessory compartment, he found a small paper envelope stamped with a Paris maker's crest designed to hold E-strings of gut construction. The envelope had been neatly opened and refolded, containing nothing but a whisper of resinous dust. "Most curious," Poirot observed, showing the envelope to Sir Benedict. "You mentioned that you no longer permit gut strings on your instruments." "Absolutely not," Sir Benedict confirmed with obvious distress. "Gut stretches abominably and plays havoc with intonation. I insist on steel for all my instruments." Thomas Finch flushed deeply. "That envelope should not be there, sir. I removed all the old gut strings weeks ago when I updated the stringing specifications." The implications were clear. Someone had deliberately placed the envelope where it would be discovered, another piece of theatrical staging designed to enhance the symbolic nature of the crime. The level of planning and attention to detail spoke of a mind obsessed not merely with murder, but with the artistic presentation of death itself. As the day progressed, additional details emerged that painted a more complex picture of the victim's recent state of mind. Sir Benedict, when pressed by Poirot's gentle questioning, revealed disturbing changes in Hart's relationship with the precious instruments he had been privileged to play. He had grown resentful, Sir Benedict admitted reluctantly. What once inspired him seemed to burden him. He spoke of the instruments as demanding masters rather than collaborative partners. Last autumn, he deliberately damaged the bridge of my Stradivarius during a private recital, claiming the instrument was fighting against his interpretation. This revelation cast Hart's final performance in a different light entirely. Miss Kerr's observation that his tempo had seemed deliberately slow, as though he were saying farewell to each note, took on deeper significance when viewed through the lens of an artist in crisis, struggling with both declining abilities and growing resentment toward the tools of his trade. "There was something else," Miss Kerr added hesitantly when Poirot encouraged her to share her complete observations. "He wasn't playing the announced piece. Instead of the Bach chaconne, I heard passages from a Tchaikovsky concerto, a piece he rarely performed publicly, but one he said held deep personal meaning for him." The image that emerged was of a man making his final, private confession through music, choosing intimate expression over public expectation in what would prove to be his last moments. This psychological portrait complicated the straightforward domestic murder that Inspector Japp favored, suggesting layers of artistic and personal torment that extended far beyond simple financial pressures. Yet even as these revelations deepened our understanding of the victim, Poirot's expression carried the satisfaction of one who perceives the true pattern beneath apparent chaos. The physical evidence pointed toward Mrs. Hart, the psychological evidence revealed a tortured artist, but the theatrical precision of the crime itself spoke of a different kind of mind entirely. "You see, Inspector," Poirot said as Japp prepared to finalize the arrest warrant, "while the evidence against Madame Hart appears compelling, the crime itself tells a different story. The symbolic use of the gut string, the careful staging of the scene, the deliberate misdirection of our investigation, these speak of someone who understood not merely how to kill, but how to transform death into a grotesque masterpiece." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Lady Vale's elegant rooms, the assembled guests awaited word of Mrs. Hart's formal arrest with a mixture of relief and unease. Yet Poirot's grey eyes held the gleam of understanding that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to a far more complex revelation. The obvious solution was merely the first movement in a symphony of deception, and the true conductor of this deadly performance had yet to take their final bow. The stage was set for the psychological game that would expose the real killer, hidden among us like a virtuoso musician waiting for their moment to step into the spotlight and claim responsibility for this most artistic of crimes. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that would fundamentally alter our understanding of the case. As Inspector Japp prepared the formal charges against Mrs. Hart, a telegram arrived bearing the crest of the Vienna Philharmonic, addressed to Felix Ardmore. The impresario's face grew ashen as he read its contents, and under Poirot's gentle but insistent questioning, he revealed news that cast the entire investigation in a dramatically different light. Hart was to have been dismissed, Ardmore admitted with obvious reluctance. The board voted unanimously to terminate his contract following complaints about his recent performances. This telegram confirms their decision was to be announced publicly next week. The implications were staggering. Hart's career was not merely declining, it was effectively over, destroyed by the very perfectionism that had once elevated him to international prominence. Yet this revelation troubled Poirot rather than satisfied him. "Most curious," he murmured, stroking his magnificent mustache. "If Monsieur Hart knew of this decision, why would he agree to perform tonight? Why risk further public humiliation with the precious Guarneri?" Dr. Pellerin, who had remained largely silent, finally spoke with clinical precision. "Hart didn't know. I spoke with him at length before the performance, and his conversation was filled with plans for future engagements, recording sessions, even talk of an American tour next autumn. Whatever demons plagued his artistry, professional despair was not among them." This psychological insight deepened the mystery considerably. If Hart remained unaware of his impending dismissal, the motive for his wife's alleged crime became less compelling. The financial pressures, while real, had not yet reached the crisis point that might drive someone to murder. It was then that Thomas Finch provided another crucial piece of our puzzle. His nervous demeanor had grown more pronounced throughout the day, and when Poirot questioned him again about the instrument's preparation, his responses carried the weight of concealed knowledge. "There was something unusual about Mr. Hart's requests yesterday," Finch admitted reluctantly. "He asked me to examine the sound holes particularly carefully, claiming he'd heard rattling during his last performance. When I investigated, I found this lodged inside the body." He produced a small piece of folded paper, yellowed with age and bearing a few lines of musical notation in faded ink. The melody was unfamiliar, written in a hand that suggested considerable age and possibly European origin. Poirot examined the manuscript fragment with intense interest. "This was inside the Guarneri when you serviced it?" "Wedged behind the sound post, sir. It would have been rattling against the interior walls whenever the instrument was played. Mr. Hart seemed quite disturbed when I showed it to him, though he claimed not to recognize the composition." Miss Kerr, when shown the manuscript, grew visibly pale. "I've seen this before. Not this exact piece, but the handwriting. My grandfather kept a collection of musical manuscripts, and this style is distinctly continental, probably German or Austrian from the early 1900s. Her observation prompted Poirot to examine the fragment more closely with his magnifying glass. In the corner, almost invisible with age, were the initials GB, written in the same faded ink as the musical notation. "GB," Poirot mused aloud. "Lady Vale, did you not mention that the previous owner of our prophetic painting was named Gaston Beaumont? Most curious that both the manuscript and the painting should find their way into this house, into this room, for this particular evening." The web of connections was becoming increasingly complex, Yet Poirot's expression carried the satisfaction of one who sees the underlying pattern beginning to emerge. He requested that we return to the green salon, where he proceeded to conduct a methodical reconstruction of the previous evening's events. "Come, Hastings," he announced, arranging the room precisely as it had been, save that the Guarneri remained under Sir Benedict's anxious guard and a student violin lay upon the chair in its place. He positioned the chair at the faint arcs left in the carpet, aligning it until his eye, more exact than any rule, was satisfied. Turning to Rosamond Kerr with a small bow, he made an unexpected request. Would Mademoiselle be so good as to play the Tchaikovsky phrase she heard? The request startled her, but she agreed, hands trembling as she took the poor substitute instrument. When she played the passage in the measured, valedictory tempo she had described, Poirot watched the mantel clock, his own immaculate timepiece open in his palm. The phrase, performed as she remembered it, carried us to 24 minutes past the hour, the hush that followed to 26. And it was at 1/2 you say, that concern became alarm, he observed mildly. How quick is the human heart to grow uneasy when the air is starved. Poirot then demonstrated the window escape theory with a loop of cord and 2 deft movements, showing how a latch might be teased from outside. Yet he shook his head and traced a finger across the misted pane. It is the possibility only, mes amis. But possibility can be purchased. To persuade the little grey cells, one must have harmony. From his pocket, he produced the empty Paris envelope for gut E strings and laid it on the side table. A pretty prop, he murmured, and almost too pretty. Using his magnifying glass, he revealed faint traces of violet powder clinging to the paper itself. The violet powder, not merely on the chair, but transferred from hand to hand without knowing. The murderer is tidy. They make art of their tidiness. They have washed very well, but not perfectly. As the afternoon progressed, Poirot engaged each suspect in seemingly casual conversation, yet his eyes missed nothing. He drew Felix Ardmore into discussion about the financial pressures of managing temperamental artists, noting the impresario's nervous perspiration and anxious glances. With Dr. Pellerin, he explored the psychology of artists who lose their creative fire while their technical skills remain intact. Thomas Finch revealed more about Hart's growing resentment toward the instruments themselves, his sense that they were fighting against rather than supporting his interpretations. Most significantly, Poirot confronted Mrs. Hart directly about the evidence against her. Madame Hart, I regret to inform you that the inspector's initial theory has proven premature. The violet powder was a deliberate plant, designed to lead us astray. Someone wished to paint a picture of a desperate wife, but the true artist behind this tableau sought a more elaborate, more symbolic canvas for their work. Mrs. Hart's composure momentarily shattered, her eyes flashing with a complex mixture of surprise, relief, and something else, perhaps indignation at being so easily dismissed as a suspect. Inspector Japp, having suffered enough of what he perceived as theatrical delays, signaled to his sergeant. Mrs. Hart was asked to put on her coat, complying without protest, though she bestowed upon Poirot a glance that contained every shade from contempt to appeal. When the front door closed behind the party from the yard, Poirot made his final arrangements with Lady Vale. He requested that all who had been present the previous evening be invited to return at 9 o'clock, under pretext of providing final statements to the police. We have applauded only the first movement, he said with grave courtesy. The time has come for the final movement of our tragic symphony. The true artistry lies not in the murder itself, but in the careful orchestration of our investigation. Someone among us has been conducting this deadly performance from the very beginning, and tomorrow they shall take their final bow. As we departed the salon, I ventured to ask whether he feared another crime. I fear impatience, he replied, and impatience, mon ami, is the false note that betrays the virtuoso who has rehearsed too well. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and I could sense that Poirot had identified not only the method, but the identity of our sophisticated killer. The obvious solution had been merely the overture to a far more complex composition, and tomorrow would bring the crescendo that would expose the truth hidden beneath layers of artistic deception. The evening of the promised revelation arrived with the peculiar weight that settles over refined gatherings when civility masks mortal suspicion. Lady Vale's drawing room, which 2 nights previous had hummed with cultured anticipation, now felt charged with the electric tension of impending judgment. The assembled company had returned as requested, though their comfortable camaraderie had been replaced by the stark awareness that one among them had orchestrated Ambrose Hart's death with chilling artistic precision. Mrs. Hart sat rigidly by the fireplace, her earlier composure now brittle as porcelain, her dark eyes reflecting the strain of her brief imprisonment and sudden release. Inspector Japp maintained his position near the doorway with characteristic stoicism, though his weathered features betrayed lingering skepticism about Poirot's insistence on this final gathering. "The evidence against Mrs. Hart seemed conclusive, Monsieur Poirot," Japp remarked with barely concealed impatience. "I hope you're not planning to muddy waters that appeared finally clear." Poirot moved among the assembled guests with theatrical calm, his small figure radiating an unusual energy that suggested the approaching climax of his investigation. "Ah, mon ami," he replied with gentle courtesy, "but evidence can be arranged as surely as flowers in a vase. Tonight we shall discover whether our bouquet has been composed by nature or by a more calculating hand." He engaged each suspect in seemingly casual conversation, yet his grey eyes missed nothing. With Felix Ardmore, he discussed the intricacies of concert programming, observing the impresario's nervous tendency to adjust his watch chain. Dr. Pellerin received inquiries about the psychological toll of artistic decline, his clinical detachment serving as armor against the human drama unfolding around him. Sir Benedict found himself drawn into conversation about instrument provenance, speaking of the unique voice each master craftsman imbued in his work. "Mademoiselle Kerr," Poirot addressed the young violinist with particular gentleness, "you mentioned that Monsieur Hart chose the Tchaikovsky over the announced Bach. This piece held special significance, no?" Rosamond's pale complexion grew even more drawn. "He rarely performed it publicly, but he once told me it was the first piece he truly mastered, not just technically but emotionally. He called it his declaration to the world, proof that he was destined for greatness." "His declaration," Poirot murmured thoughtfully, "and yet played in such a deliberate, valedictory manner. Most curious." The little Belgian detective then made an unexpected announcement. "Mes amis, I must confess that our investigation has revealed layers of deception far more complex than the obvious domestic tragedy Inspector Japp initially suspected. The evidence against Madame Hart was carefully planted, designed to conceal a crime of extraordinary sophistication." He gestured toward the green salon, visible through the connecting doorway. "If you would be so good as to join me, I shall demonstrate how this elaborate deception was accomplished." As the gathering reluctantly filed into the smaller room, Poirot positioned himself before the prophetic painting, his attention focused on details that had escaped our earlier notice. "Observe, if you please, this remarkable work. Le Violonist qui joua pour personne." Lady Vale acquired it from the estate of one Gaston Beaumont, whose initials, G.B., match those found on the manuscript fragment hidden within the Guarneri. Dr. Pellerin adjusted his spectacles with clinical precision. "Surely you're not suggesting some elaborate conspiracy involving a deceased Parisian collector?" "Not deceased, mon ami, but transformed. Gaston Beaumont was known among certain circles for his unique method of preserving valuable manuscripts, concealing them within the frames of paintings, safe from the authorities who might question their provenance." Poirot's voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. The manuscript fragment found in the violin was merely the first movement of a complete composition, the remainder hidden where only someone with intimate knowledge of Beaumont's methods would think to look. With deliberate casualness, Poirot reached up and adjusted the painting's position, tilting it slightly askew. The asymmetry created a small but noticeable imperfection in the room's careful arrangement. "Forgive me, Lady Vale, but I find myself unable to concentrate when surrounded by disorder." He stepped back, apparently satisfied with his adjustment, though the crooked frame created an almost palpable sense of wrongness in the precisely appointed room. "Now then," Poirot continued, "I believe Inspector Japp requires a final statement from each of you. I shall step into the adjoining room to review my notes. Hastings, if you would accompany me." As we moved toward the connecting door, I noticed the effect of the deliberately crooked painting on our assembled suspects. Sir Benedict winced visibly, but remained seated. Thomas Finch's hands fluttered nervously, then stilled. Miss Kerr clutched her handbag more tightly. But it was Dr. Pellerin whose reaction proved most telling. His clinical composure cracked as his gaze returned repeatedly to the asymmetrical frame, his fingers drumming an unconscious rhythm against his knee. From the adjoining room, I could observe the green salon through the partially open door. Poirot had positioned us perfectly to witness what followed. Dr. Pellerin's discomfort with the crooked painting grew more pronounced with each passing moment. His scholarly precision, which had served him so. The evening of reckoning arrived with the same deceptive elegance that had marked our first gathering, yet the atmosphere in Lady Vale's drawing-room carried an undercurrent of tension that no amount of civilized conversation could disguise. At precisely 9 o'clock, as Poirot had decreed, the assembled guests took their places with the reluctant precision of actors returning to a stage where tragedy had already claimed its victim. The rain drummed softly against the windows, blurring the lamps of Belgrave Square into watery stars, while each face bore the strain of 24 hours spent under the shadow of suspicion. Inspector Japp occupied his stern vantage near the doorway, a uniformed sergeant at his side, his weathered features carrying the skeptical expression of a practical man forced to indulge what he considered theatrical nonsense. Mrs. Hart, permitted to attend under tacit supervision, sat with rigid posture and unreadable eyes, while Sir Benedict hovered protectively near his Guarneri case. Felix Ardmore dabbed his forehead with obvious nervousness. Dr. Pellerin polished his spectacles with clinical precision, and Miss Rosamond Kerr sat very pale, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles stood out like ivory. Poirot remained standing before the fireplace, his fastidious figure seeming to draw the room to a point of absolute stillness. He did not begin with accusation, but with order, reminding us methodically of each piece of evidence that had emerged during our investigation. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began with courteous gravity, "we have been presented with what appeared to be an impossible crime, a locked room, a victim arranged with theatrical precision, and evidence that seemed to point inexorably toward one conclusion. Yet the little grey cells, they insist that we have been watching a performance within a performance, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to lead us astray." He gestured toward the green salon, where the prophetic painting remained visible through the open doors. That masterpiece, Le Violonist qui joua pour personne, acquired so recently from the estate of one Gaston Beaumont. Most curious that both this artwork and the manuscript fragment discovered within the Guarneri should find their way into this house for this particular evening. Thomas Finch shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bandaged finger worrying at the fabric of his jacket, yet Poirot's attention seemed to encompass the entire gathering rather than focusing on any single individual. "We have examined the physical evidence with care," Poirot continued, his voice carrying the gentle precision of a conductor guiding his orchestra through a complex passage. "The diagonal smear across the window glass, suggesting a cord used to manipulate the latch from outside. The scuffed earth in the garden below, darkened with dew that had crept inward, proving the disturbance was made earlier than the time of death. The violet powder so carefully placed upon gloves and chair and envelope, each detail designed to create a false crescendo of guilt. His grey eyes moved systematically around the room, noting the subtle reactions of each guest. And the music itself, not Bach's architectural precision as announced, but Tchaikovsky's melancholy canzonetta, played with deliberate slowness behind a locked door. The ear that selected this piece understood how to be believed through a barrier, how to create the illusion of heart's presence while concealing a far different reality. Dr. Pellerin cleared his throat diplomatically. You suggest the music we heard was not Hart's final performance? Indeed, mon ami. The tempo, the choice of piece, even the technical execution, all spoke of a different hand, a different artistic sensibility. Someone who understood both Hart's repertoire and the psychological effect such music would have upon our assembled company. Poirot moved to examine the manuscript fragment once more, holding the yellowed paper up to the light. The initials GB led us initially to consider Gaston Beaumont, the collector and critic. Yet further investigation revealed a more tragic connection. Gustav Brenner, a promising young violinist whose career was destroyed by harsh criticism in 1923. Brenner took his own life shortly after that devastating review, and this fragment of his composition became a symbol of artistic destruction. The revelation struck Thomas Finch like a physical blow, his face draining of color as he realized that his carefully constructed anonymity had been pierced by Poirot's methodical investigation. You see, mes amis, Poirot continued with inexorable gentleness, Monsieur Finch was more than merely an instrument restorer. He was the protégé of Gaston Beaumont himself, trained not only in technical skills, but in the profound appreciation of these precious instruments and their sacred trust with true artistry. When Beaumont died last year, Finch inherited not merely his knowledge, but his obsession with preserving musical purity against those who would profane it. The psychological portrait that emerged was of a man driven by a twisted sense of artistic justice, someone who had appointed himself guardian of musical heritage against performers who possessed technique without soul. Finch's access to the instruments, his technical expertise, and his position of trust had provided the perfect cover for his elaborate scheme. The method was ingenious in its symbolic precision, Poirot explained, his voice carrying the admiration that one craftsman might show for another's work. During your afternoon maintenance session, Monsieur Finch, you prepared more than routine adjustments. The gut E-string, procured specially for this purpose, was concealed within the instrument's body, rigged to a simple but deadly mechanism triggered by the violin's own vibrations when played with sufficient intensity. Sir Benedict gasped in horror. You mean the Guarneri itself became the murder weapon? Precisely. When Hart drew his bow across the steel E-string with the force required for the Tchaikovsky passage, it triggered the release of the concealed gut string, which snapped around his throat with lethal precision. The cruel irony was complete. Hart died embracing the very instrument he had grown to resent, yet unable to coax from it the music that had once flowed so freely. The room fell into stunned silence as the full scope of the artistry became clear. This was not merely murder, but a grotesque parody of artistic creation, transforming the tools of beauty into instruments of death while forcing the victim to participate unknowingly in his own destruction. Thomas Finch sat motionless, his craftsman's hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the assembled company. The mask of humble servitude had fallen away, revealing beneath it the face of a man consumed by artistic fanaticism, someone who believed that death itself could be justified in service of preserving musical purity. He was destroying them, Finch said quietly, his voice carrying the calm resignation of a man whose masterpiece had been fully appreciated at last. All of them, the Stradivarius, the Amati, and now the Guarneri. These instruments have voices that span centuries, and he was silencing them with his mechanical technique and dead interpretation. Someone had to preserve their dignity. as Inspector Japp moved forward to make the arrest, Poirot's expression carried both satisfaction and profound sadness. The case had been solved through the methodical application of psychological insight, yet the solution revealed depths of human corruption that even his experienced mind found deeply troubling. The violinist who played for no one had indeed found his final audience, not in the elegant gathering that had assembled to hear his music, but in the twisted appreciation of a killer who had transformed murder itself into a grotesque work of art, believing that death could serve beauty better than life ever could. The drawing-room's silence lingered long after the handcuffs had closed around Thomas Finch's wrists. Each figure seemed to shrink into themselves, the elegant surroundings now heavy with the memory of violence and deception. Finch, composed and eerily serene, met Poirot's gaze not with anger or fear, but with the resigned dignity of an artist who has finished his magnum opus, however twisted its form. Inspector Japp, businesslike but visibly unsettled, led Finch away. The remaining guests glanced at one another, Sir Benedict with a hand on the Guarneri's case as if comforting a wounded child, Mrs. Hart standing rigid and pale, Rosamond Kerr trembling, torn between relief and sorrow. Lady Vale murmured apologies to no one in particular, her composure eroded by guilt for her role in preparing the locked room. Poirot, for his part, seemed to bear the burden of understanding as much as the satisfaction of resolution. When calm had partially returned, Poirot gathered the company for the final explanation. He began with the murder's mechanics. Monsieur Finch, as restorer, had rare access and skill. During his maintenance of the Guarneri, he concealed within it a deadly mechanism, a length of gut E string coiled and attached to a spring-loaded trigger, itself hidden behind the sound post. This device was ingeniously designed to respond to the vibrations of the steel E string when played with great force, particularly in the Tchaikovsky passage Heart Favored That Night. At the precise moment, the trigger released the gut string, which snapped taut around Hart's throat. Death was almost instantaneous. The broken string, found at Hart's feet, was not simply a symbol, but the weapon itself, having completed its purpose and fallen free. Poirot continued. Finch anticipated that Hart's final convulsions might disturb the scene. So, after the mechanism had done its work, Finch, having prepared the window latch and a cord system in advance, slipped silently into the room. His knowledge of the house's rhythms and the music's length made his timing flawless. He arranged the body, placed the violin and bow with ceremonial care, and ensured the tableau matched the painting above the mantel. The key was replaced on the side table, and the door pulled closed behind him. The latch, loosened by Lady Vale's order the previous afternoon, clicked shut and gave the illusion of a room locked from within. The window, relatched, bore only a faint smear from the cord, and the garden below showed scuffed earth from Finch's earlier preparations, made before the night's dew. Poirot now addressed the web of misdirection. The violet powder on Mrs. Hart's gloves, the faint traces on the chair and on the empty Paris string envelope. Each was a deliberate plant. Finch, knowing Mrs. Hart's habits and routine, engineered minor contacts to ensure the powder would transfer. The envelope, placed in the violin's compartment, was meant to reinforce the idea that the murder weapon was a gut string and to direct suspicion away from himself. Even the 6-minute discrepancy in the mantel clock was calculated to disorient the timeline and obscure the period when the murder could occur unseen. He paused, then gently drew the psychological portrait. But why such artistry in death? Finch's confession and the evidence reveal a mind warped by aesthetic purity, one who saw himself as the instrument's guardian, punishing Hart for what he saw as crimes against true music. The placement of the Brenner manuscript, the acquisition of the painting Le Violoniste qui joua pour personne, these were not random. They were chosen to confront Hart with the spectre of lost artistry, to heighten his sense of isolation, and to transform his death into a symbolic act. In his mind, He was not merely killing hard, but preserving the dignity of the Guarneri and all the sacred instruments entrusted to his care. Dr. Pellerin, shaken, murmured, "Even a critic cannot judge who shall live." Sir Benedict, voice hoarse, promised the Guarneri would be cared for, though the promise sounded like mourning. Mrs. Hart approached Poirot, her gratitude mingled with bitterness. "You have cleared me, but you have not spared me." Poirot inclined his head, grave. "Truth does not spare, madame. It only restores order." Rosamond Kerr, tears in her eyes, was told by Poirot that one must not let tragedy dictate the future of one's music. "Courage, mademoiselle. To play is to speak. One must not let the murderer write the cadenza." As the gathering dispersed, Poirot and I walked into the misty London night. I could not help but ask, "But, Poirot, so much depended on the smallest details. The chair's arcs, the slow clock, the music, the powder. How were you so sure?" He smiled gently. "It is always the voice that lies, Hastings. The garden, the latch, the powder, they are but notes in a false melody. But the interval, the silence, the psychological discord, these betray the conductor of the crime. Only by listening to the space between the notes, the extra beat, does one perceive the hand behind the illusion." In the days that followed, the newspapers dwelled on the scandal and the tragedy. Sir Benedict withdrew his treasures from public loan, the Guarneri consigned to quiet safety. Lady Vale had the prophetic painting removed, unable to bear its presence. Mrs. Hart vanished from society's view, and Rosamond, perhaps, played her music with a new, deeper understanding. Only Poirot seemed untouched by the storm, though I sensed a melancholy beneath his composure. One evening, sharing a quiet meal, I raised my glass. "To the little grey cells?" He stopped me with a smile. "Non, mon ami. Tonight, to the ear, for it was not the footprint nor the powder that revealed the truth, but the interval, the pause, the discordant silence." He set his cup down neatly. Order and method, and a little music, played this time, for someone. Thus ended the affair of the violinist who played for no one. In the end, it was not the perfection of death, but the imperfection of the human heart that revealed the truth and restored, however imperfectly, a measure of order to the world Poirot so loved. The weeks that followed brought the inevitable conclusion to our tragic affair, though the echoes of that evening in Belgrave Square would resonate far longer than any of us anticipated. Thomas Finch, when brought to trial, maintained his composed demeanor throughout the proceedings, speaking of his actions with the detached precision of a craftsman describing his technique. His defense counsel attempted to argue temporary insanity, but the meticulous planning revealed in Poirot's testimony made such claims untenable. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours before returning their verdict, and Finch received the sentence that his calculated artistry demanded. In the days preceding his execution, Finch requested a final meeting with Poirot, a request that the little Belgian detective granted with characteristic courtesy, despite his obvious reluctance. I accompanied him to Pentonville Prison on a grey morning that seemed to mirror the solemnity of our purpose. We found Finch in his cell, seated at a small table where he had been writing what appeared to be musical notation with meticulous care. "Monsieur Poirot," Finch said with genuine warmth, rising to greet us as though we were visitors to his workshop rather than witnesses to his final days. "I wish to thank you for the elegance of your investigation. Few would have appreciated the artistry involved in my work, but you understood both the method and the meaning." Poirot studied the condemned man with the same careful attention he had given to the evidence, noting the serenity that seemed to emanate from someone who had made peace with the consequences of his actions. "You speak of artistry, Monsieur Finch, yet what you created was destruction masquerading as preservation. The instruments you claim to protect have been silenced by your actions as surely as if you had broken them with your own hands." "Perhaps," Finch replied thoughtfully, returning to his notation. But Hart would have continued to profane them, to reduce their voices to mere mechanical exercises devoid of soul. I gave them dignity in their silence, transformed them from victims of his mediocrity into participants in something far more meaningful. The manuscript he showed us was a completion of the Brenner fragment. The melody developed into a full composition of haunting beauty that spoke of loss and redemption in equal measure. Gustav Brenner's final work, he explained with obvious pride. I have spent these weeks completing what criticism destroyed decades ago. Perhaps this too is a form of preservation. As we prepared to leave, Finch made one final request that revealed the depth of his obsession. The Guarneri. I trust Sir Benedict will care for her properly. She has witnessed much and deserves peace in her remaining years. Poirot's response carried both compassion and firmness. The instruments will be cared for, monsieur, but by those who understand that their purpose is to create beauty, not to serve as monuments to twisted justice. The execution took place 3 days later, and with it ended the life of a man whose technical brilliance had been corrupted by aesthetic fanaticism. Yet the ripples of his actions continued to spread through the musical world like concentric circles on a disturbed pond. Sir Benedict, true to his word, withdrew his entire collection from public access, unable to bear the thought of entrusting such precious instruments to performers whose dedication might prove insufficient. The Guarneri itself was placed in a specially constructed case, its voice silenced not by violence but by the protective fear of its guardian. In seeking to preserve the instrument's dignity, Finch had achieved the very result he claimed to oppose, the reduction of a living voice to a museum piece. Mrs. Hart, cleared of all suspicion but forever marked by the scandal, departed London for the Continent, where she established a modest music school in a Swiss village. Her letters, which Poirot occasionally shared with me, spoke of finding peace in teaching children whose enthusiasm remained untainted by the complexities of professional ambition. Miss Rosamond Kerr proved more resilient than her delicate appearance suggested. She continued her studies with renewed determination, eventually earning recognition for her interpretations of works by composers who had struggled against adversity. Her performances, according to the critics, carried an emotional depth that spoke of hard-won wisdom, transforming tragedy into artistic growth. Lady Vale, deeply troubled by her unwitting role in facilitating the murder, devoted herself to charitable works supporting struggling musicians. The Green Salon was converted into a library, the prophetic painting replaced by portraits of composers whose lives had ended in tragedy. She never again hosted musical evenings, claiming that silence was preferable to the risk of corrupting art with violence. Felix Ardmore found his career irreparably damaged by association with the scandal, eventually retiring from the music business to open a small shop dealing in rare manuscripts where his knowledge could serve preservation rather than promotion. Dr. Pellerin, perhaps most affected by the revelation that criticism could drive men to such extremes, moderated his reviews considerably, finding ways to encourage improvement rather than destroy careers. As for Poirot himself, the case remained one that he rarely discussed in detail, though I occasionally caught him listening to recordings of violin music with an expression of profound melancholy. When I asked him once whether he regretted solving the case, given the destruction it had wrought upon so many lives, his response was characteristically thoughtful. The truth, mon ami, is like music itself. It exists independently of our desire to hear it. My role is not to judge whether the melody is pleasant, but to ensure that it is played correctly, with all its harmonies and discordances intact. Thomas Finch created his own composition, and it was my duty to conduct its final performance. One evening, as we sat in our comfortable rooms, I found Poirot meticulously arranging his collection of small porcelain figurines, each piece placed with mathematical precision upon the mantelpiece. The case, though closed, clearly still occupied his thoughts. "It is always the order that is most important, Hastings," he mused, adjusting a tiny shepherdess with infinite care. The physical evidence, the clues, they are like scattered notes upon a page. But it is the psychological insight, the understanding of human nature, that provides the harmony that allows the true melody to emerge. I pondered his words, thinking of Finch's chilling dedication to his twisted ideal. He truly believed he was preserving something beautiful, didn't he, Poirot? Poirot sighed, a sound that carried the weight of understanding human frailty. Ah, mon ami, the human heart is capable of the most exquisite music and also the most discordant noise. Finch saw himself as a conductor, silencing what he deemed imperfect. But no man has the right to decide which voices deserve to be heard, no matter how pure his intentions may appear. He placed the final figurine with a gentle click. The tragedy is not merely that a man died, but that another destroyed his own soul in the name of a misguided ideal of perfection. The affair of the violinist who played for no one thus concluded not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from restoring order to chaos, even when that order reveals uncomfortable truths about the human capacity for self-deception. In the end, the greatest tragedy was not Hart's death, but the realization that the pursuit of artistic perfection, when corrupted by fanaticism, could transform the tools of beauty into instruments of destruction. The case file, meticulously maintained in Poirot's precise handwriting, contains a final note that perhaps best captures the essence of our investigation. The music ended not because the performer lacked skill, but because the audience forgot how to listen with compassion. In seeking perfection, we sometimes silence the very voices we claim to preserve. And so the violinist who played for no one found his final audience, not in the elegant gathering that had assembled to hear his music, but in the careful attention of those who sought to understand why the music had to end. The Guarneri del Gesù remains in its case, waiting perhaps for a day when the memory of tragedy fades sufficiently to allow beauty to overcome the shadow of violence. Until then, it serves as a reminder that even the most precious instruments are meaningless without the human hands and hearts that bring them to life, and that the true preservation of art lies not in silencing imperfection, but in nurturing the courage to continue playing, despite our flaws, for those who still remember how to listen.